And welcome to MacroBusiness Radio Podcast. Thank you very much for your time. Today I'm joined by Deep T and Leith Van Onselen. Good morning, gentlemen. We live in a world of rapidly changing macros, for starters, but the news of the morning, as far as I'm concerned, is that the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, announced to the National Press Club within the next couple of hours that there's going to be a productivity round table in late August. And according to the ABC reporting this morning, he's talking about opening the door to tax reform. Now, at the moment, I would observe Australia as an economy is comprised of some of the most expensive people in the world, operating in some of the most expensive buildings in the world, with some of the most expensive electricity and internet. Leith, I'll go first to you and pose the question, where is the Australian economy at right now? I've heard you refer to it as a tax and spend economy in the not distant past. Can you just give us a brief overview of where we're at and what you would anticipate coming out of any sort of productivity roundtable?
Economy is basically in a morass. So if you just look at the latest national accounts, so this is indicative of the Australian economy, 9 out of the last 11 quarters, we've had per capita GDP decline. So yes, the overall economy has continued to grow incredibly slowly, very poorly, but everyone's slice of the economic pie has been shrinking. And Australia's productivity is deplorable, productivity growth. So we've had the lowest growth out of advanced nations since about 2018. This productivity summit is long overdue, but I don't think it's going to amount to much. According to the AFR, AFR's comments on Treasurer Chalmers' upcoming speech, so they've obviously got an advanced copy of the speech. Chalmers outlined 4 areas for productivity. And, first of all, he said Australia's economy is not dynamic or innovative enough. Well, yeah, obviously it's not. Australia's R&D spending is the lowest in the advanced world. Yep. So we have incredibly low capital investment. Our whole economy is effectively, houses and holes, as the moniker goes. And I'd argue that Chalmers' comments are actually a shot at our high immigration growth model because, first of all, he said, obviously, we're not dynamic or innovative enough. Second, he said private investment has picked up, but it's not enough to make capital deep enough, which is a very important point because in the post-war period, the majority of Australia's productivity growth, I'm talking like 80%, has been caused by capital deepening. So what that is, that's an increase in the capital-labour ratio. So effectively what that means is that in the post-war period, what has driven Australia's productivity growth is that we've given workers more tools, more machinery, more everything to work with, and that's made them more efficient. So, I've used this example before of what capital deepening, like to sort of highlight what capital deepening means. If you run a cafe and you've got 1 coffee machine and 2 workers working that coffee machine, it can churn out 100 coffees an hour. If you double the number of workers to 4, but don't double the number of coffee machines, the output per worker is going to fall. And it's going to fall because there's going to be congestion, they're going to have to wait for each other, etc. They're going to get less productive per person, right? And that's effectively what the Australian economy has done. So since the turn of the century, we've grown by about 8.7 million people. We've flooded the place with migrants, effectively, new people. We haven't grown the infrastructure to keep up. We haven't grown the business investment to keep up. And as a result, our capital to labour ratio has not grown. And in fact, in the last decade, it's fallen. And we've actually had what's called capital shallowing. And that has made us a far less productive place. Jim, thirdly, the third factor that, so number one was, we're not innovative and dynamic enough, according to Chalmers. Number 2 was we haven't had enough capital deepening. Well, that sort of gets to if capital deepening is capital to labour ratio and your labour goes up a lot through immigration, that's obviously going to reduce that capital labour ratio, which is exactly what we've had. Third, he says skills aren't abundant enough. This is a direct quote. Skills aren't abundant enough or matched well enough to business needs. Well, I find that astonishing, given that we've grown the population by 8.7 million people this century, supposedly through skilled migration, and yet we don't have enough skills to meet the economy's needs. That to me is a direct shot at Australia's migration system. He won't, present it that way, but that's what it is. Because we've grown the economy aggressively through population growth, i.e. immigration, and it's purportedly skilled, but we don't have enough skills in the economy. It doesn't make any sense. And then he says, finally, this is another quote directly, finally, our challenging industrial base and the growth in services where productivity is harder to find and where traditional measures don't account well for quality. That is his fourth reason for our poor productivity growth. Well, that's exactly right. We've gutted our manufacturing sector. Australia has the smallest manufacturing share in the OECD. It is collapsing because of high energy costs and other things. Previously, it was because of the high Australian dollar when the mining boom came, as well as a reduction in tariffs and that sort of thing. But more recently, the decline in Australia's manufacturing sector has been because we've decided to give ourselves some of the most expensive energy in the world, despite being the second biggest gas exporter in the world, the biggest coal exporter, having tons of uranium. We should have incredibly cheap energy in Australia, but we've chosen through this net zero delusion to effectively give ourselves incredibly expensive manufacturing, and that's setting our manufacturing offshore. We've got a less developed and diversified economy. We've become more services dependent, which is, let's face it, people servicing. A lot of, NDIS type jobs, cafes, whatever. These are low productive jobs.
Can I just pause you about there, because closer to that services economy, both at a high finance level but also a small business level, is Deep T. Deep T, when you and I have spoken at length about these types of issues, and I've also spoken with Leith previously, what's your perception of what Leith's talking about?
I agree with nearly everything Leith said. I'm always concentrate on the external account, and mining, coal, and selling gas and has kept us in a positive trading balance for a number of years, nowhere near enough, but we've recently again lapsed into a current account deficit, which according to the budget is going to continue to grow, and if commodity prices continue to decrease, it'll grow at an ever faster rate. If the rest of the world continues to lend us money to fill the hole, that is the decrease in the money supply from having a deficit that we would have to fund by selling Australian dollars, then we'll just keep on going along with it. And that's encouraged a situation where you don't need to be productive, or don't think you need to be productive, because at that very moment, you're borrowing money to fill the hole. You're not being productive either internally, because you're just spreading money around, a lot of which is borrowed money, and not needing to be productive to sell goods offshore.
At that point, I'd say Victoria is the standout example of exactly what you're talking about. We have a state which has largely ceased to be in any way productive. Leith, I'll come back to you again. What Deep T is talking about is fundamentally your tax and spend economy, which you've referred to a number of times. And the driver that he is referring to, the bubble blower, if you like, of the commodity exports, we are starting to slide beneath the waves again. Australia traditionally runs a current account deficit. It's had the period above the waves for the last 10 years, 10, 15 years. We have a fundamentally uncompetitive economy, and as DT is saying, unless the world wants to give us the money, and there would be no basis for them to do so, we need to find productive drivers of economic growth, which is the underlying dynamic driving Treasurer Chalmers' approach, I assume. How do you see what sort of, like, he's talking about all these things that we need to change. I agree with you that immigration and the bubble effect of flooding the country with very heavy numbers of migrants is a massive issue on behalf of Treasurer Chalmers, that he wants to have some sort of productivity reform without killing the current economy. So I would imagine that's going to be a very, very tricky balancing equation. How do you see that type of thing playing out?
Yeah, I think it's going to be complete window dressing. He's not going to address the fundamentals of the economy, what's driving the economy, which is mass population growth, and housing bubble. I mean, let's face it. Is he going to address those things? Is he going to dramatically cut immigration and make it focused solely on skills, like very highly skilled and highly paid people, which is what it should be?
Yep.
Or is he just going to keep running the same old racket that he's been running? Of course he is. And he's going to do it for a number of reasons, because that's what his donors want. Big business, big property, the education industry now, the universities, etc. They all love big migration. The Australian Treasury loves big migration because he's the treasurer whose own department, the Australian Treasury, loves this stuff. Why do they love it? Because the federal government collects 80% of tax revenues, and they get all the company tax and all the personal tax from migration, but the costs don't fall on the federal government. The costs are deferred on the states and on private individuals. So, classic example, if you live in Sydney, you've seen and Melbourne to a less extent, but Sydney is a classic example. You've seen your living standards get destroyed in the last 25 years. Why is that? Because your population has grown by, about 1.5 million people. They've had to build toll roads everywhere to squeeze those extra people in. Guess who owns the toll roads? Transurban, a private monopoly. So now to drive around Sydney, the turn of the century, they had about 2 toll roads. Sydney Harbour Bridge and Tunnel, I count them as one, and then the one near the airport. Now you've got about 15 toll roads. You can't drive around Sydney without having a private monopoly, Transurban, ripping money out of your pocket. And why did they build those toll roads? To keep up with the mass immigration from the federal government. So that's effectively private tax now, paying to Transurban. Your living standards are getting degraded. You've been forced to live in shoebox apartments instead of homes. Obviously, cost to rent, cost to buy is unbelievable. Those are all costs of immigration. Water supplies, all these sorts of things. The federal government doesn't bear those costs. The residents do. But the federal government doesn't care because it gets all the company tax and all the personal income tax from migration. So that's why they love it as well. So anyone believing that the federal government's going to suddenly abandon its mass immigration policy is deluded. Also, we've obviously got new trade agreements and other agreements with India, where we've agreed to effectively run I wouldn't say open borders regime with India, but a much more generous migration regime. India's got 1.4 billion people. They're going to want to keep coming here, so we're going to keep admitting them. And then on the housing side, let's face it, without it's short term, it's not great growth, it's low calorie growth, but the housing bubble is to a lot of extent the Australian economy now, the domestic economy. We've got a housing market that is now values every single home in Australia, that's house, unit, apartment, as at an average of $1 million.
Well, one of the things I come back to as I listen to this, and I must admit I fundamentally agree with both of you, is just how sustainable the model we have right now, which is we are currently in a situation, I was looking at charts the other day showing that about 3/4 of all jobs growth over the last 3 years, so the last term of the first term of the Labor government, was essentially driven by government spending. It's not driven by the private sector. And at a certain level, the government will simply have to cease spending because the revenues simply aren't going to be there. And even now, the actual bang for buck for some of that government spending must be questioned at a number of levels. Deep T, can I bring you back in there? What you think the government can actually do, and how imminent the need to actually do something. At the moment, we still have a bubble that plausibly works, but the point at which it may cease to start working or start to cease working, that can't be that far away. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with it. Now, let's again take a slightly different spin on it. I again always reiterate the point that if someone external to Australia, some country, and investors continue to lend us money, we're not going to come to a crisis that will stimulate change. Now, no, of course that can't go on forever. What is the limit? Well, having been a banker and been offshore, I mean, I realise that perception is much more important than reality until it isn't. And the perception of Australia having a stronger balance sheet, which we in the media and around the world quote numbers that can look us comparatively as not being as bad as it should be. And
it was once described to me by a London-based investment banker as, he said, it's like this. If I'm selling to the guy over the street in London on a message that Australia's a land of everything's okay and a strong balance sheet, particularly federally, then all you need to do is sell to the guy over the street in London. But we've got to live in it, as Leith is pointing out, and there are a number of inherent contradictions which crop up, including the congested roads, the congested services. But fundamentally, I find myself wondering how many people are getting genuinely meaningful jobs in this economy.
Well, very few, because there are very few meaningful jobs.
Yep.
People are picking up whatever they can. And immigration just keeps continuing to dumb it down. Immigration is a cost. Unless those immigrants are either working in productive sectors that export out of the country or are taking jobs from other workers that are doing that, they're a cost. And the cost keeps mounting.
Yep.
It's hidden. The federal government's balance sheet is not Australia's balance sheet. We've got to look at Australia's balance sheet, which includes all the states and private enterprise. And, of course, that means the banks. And that balance sheet does not look anywhere near as good as what the federal government and the Treasury would have everyone think about the balance sheet of Australia. Australia is like a hedge fund. I've said this before, but just look at internally, yes, it's housing and
Commodities.
The government. Well, it's housing and government jobs that are keeping everything running. On the external side, we keep borrowing money in to do that. But we're actually also, on the other side of it, the super funds are actually investing quite a lot offshore. Although I think there's some really dodgy numbers when I look at the accounts released by the ABS, but nevertheless, so we're borrowing money to invest offshore, and they're actually recognising a gain on selling that money that we're borrowing offshore, which keeps the currency a bit stronger than it should be. It's one hell of a hedge fund that no one sort of knows about. It's not one organisation, but the state, the federal government, the state governments, the banks, the superannuation funds, which all are big on their own, but when they combine to effectively manipulate the system just to keep it going, you've got a situation where, well, there has to be a day of reckoning. It's not going to slowly go down.
Can I just bring us back at that point, and I'll go to you, Leith. Right at the moment, we've got a situation where within the last few days, the Abu Dhabi-led national investment company is leading a consortium to basically buy the Australian underpinning of the gas cartel. And we're talking about, I think it was $30 billion.
Yep.
And there's been repeated calls and questions about taxing or increasing the tax on a very small number of people, about 80,000 is my understanding, who have superannuation balances of more than 3 million. It seems to me to be a difficult political sell for any reform at the moment. You've just said that you're expecting window dressing largely out of this. But do you think, surely to God, even Treasury must be saying, hang on, we really do need to bring about some form of meaningful productivity? And unless you assume that we can just keep selling the la-la land to ourselves, someone must at some point bring about something which makes us more competitive. And I'm just wondering, I would have thought if you're not going to abolish it, then making superannuation work better for Australia would be a start. I would also think, going on today's headlines, that the taxation system itself needs to be looked at. To that, I would probably add state, Commonwealth, financial relations need to be looked at, and also the taxation of Australia's commodity exports. But for what both of you guys are referring to, when we're talking about we want capital deepening, and DT is talking about we want people employed in high-paying jobs from exporting sectors, our exporting sectors are about 2% of the labour force, or 3%. You know, the commodities and the agricultural sector, a very, very small number of other people. Leith's already pointed out we invest less in research and development. We've got a smaller manufacturing sector. Surely someone must be thinking we've got to do something.
Yeah, look, Australia does everything back to front, right? So the worst thing a country that is rich in commodity wealth and has, a massive endowment of natural wealth can do is grow its population like a science experiment, because all you do is you dilute the nation's wealth, right? So I'd argue that at the turn of the century, Australia had about 19 million people. We've now got 27.6 or something million people. We've done that in less than 25 years, right? That is a stupid policy. When you pay your way in the world, if you look at Australia's top exports, top goods exports, so merchandise exports, about the top 20 are all commodities and farming, right? Now, yes, there's so-called international education on the services side, but a lot of that's fake, as we know, because most of them come here, they work, they spend money from money they earn in Australia, which is then counted as an export, which is wrong. They also send remittances back home, which is actually an import. So that figure is grossly overestimated. But, when you think about it, the overall majority of Australia's wealth, export income, comes from the regions, right? So they come from the regional areas of Australia. That's where all the commodities come from. That's where all the agriculture comes from. Yet our policy is to grow our capital cities like science experiments, balloon them up in size. Melbourne was 3.5 million people at the turn of the century. It's forecast to it's about 5.5 currently. So it's already grown by 2 million people this century, which is ridiculous. It's forecast to go to 9 million people by 2050. So another 3.5 million people in the next 25 years. So what took us 165 years to get to 3.5 million people at the turn of the century, we're going to add that again in the next 25 years, according to the predictions. Sydney, about 8.5 million. Brisbane, roughly the size of Melbourne now, by about 2060 or whatever. So our whole policy is to dilute the nation's mineral wealth, bring in truckloads of people to live in our capital cities, to work in services jobs that don't earn export income, and that dilutes the nation's wealth, right? It also reduces our productivity because through the capital shell-in effect, etc. We've got to build houses instead of running productive businesses. We distort the entire capital base. That is the Australian policy. And unfortunately, this can go on for a very long time. But what we're doing is we're effectively boiling the frog slowly. So what I mean by the frog is our individual living standards. And that's why our per capita growth, our per capita GDP growth has been falling for about 2 decades since we started this big immigration experiment. It doesn't mean we haven't had positive GDP per capita growth, but the rate of growth has fallen alongside our productivity. Yeah. And that, the worst thing a country like Australia can do is rich in mineral endowments is grow its population aggressively, as I said, because you dilute it. The second worst thing you can do, which is also what we've done, is we don't tax that stuff properly. So if you compare us, the counterexample, the extreme counterexample is Norway. All right, so Norway has experienced about 25% population growth since the 1960s. We've experienced over 150%, probably about 170 now. Right, Norway has, abundant oil and gas resources through the North Sea, and they're a major exporter, right? But what Norway does is they have to run a very tight immigration program. They've also taxed their oil and gas riches through their sovereign wealth fund at about close to 80%, right? So what they effectively do is they're a massive exporter. They tax that stuff at roughly 80%, just under 80%. A lot of their companies are actually government owned, so they're owned by the Norwegian people. They then are smart because what they've done is they've used that tax wealth through their resource exports. They've created a sovereign wealth fund, which is the biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world. They've directed that sovereign wealth fund to only invest offshore, which keeps the Norwegian kroner lower valuation, which makes them more competitive. And now they're the biggest owners of Microsoft and a whole bunch of other companies. And that sovereign wealth fund is worth over $300,000 US per Norwegian resident. Now, can you imagine what would have happened if Norway did what we did? Instead of growing by 25% since 1960, it grew by 170%. Do you think their sovereign wealth fund be worth more than $300,000 US per resident or less? Of course it'd be less because they'd be spreading it over so many more people, right? So we do all the wrong things here. We grow where we should be the richest country on earth. We've got abundant resources in everything other than oil, right? We've got everything in this country and we've got a fairly small population. But instead we don't tax that stuff properly. And then we grow a population aggressively, which then starves us of our mineral wealth per capita. When what we could have done, and this is obviously you need a DeLorean to go back in time and change everything. But if I could, I would. We could have copied Norway and we could have not grown our population aggressively. We could be a population around 20 million, sitting on a massive mineral endowment that earns us actual money because we tax the stuff properly, and we'd be incredibly wealthy and rich, and we'd have all the money we need to fund our health, education, NDIS, all this sort of stuff, proper infrastructure, whatever you name it. And if we did what Norway did, we actually invested that money offshore, the Australian dollar would be lower as well. And we'd have a more competitive manufacturing industry. But we don't do any of this stuff. We've done the complete opposite of what a country should do. We've grown the population aggressively when we're a massive mineral exporter, which dilutes the nation's mineral wealth per capita. And then we haven't taxed our mineral wealth properly. So we don't get the revenue.
Can I just go to the outstanding example of that untaxed commodity export, and that is gas.
100%.
We not only export the gas and allow the infrastructure built by the private gas cartel to amortise away their contribution to the Australian budget situation, but we also make that gas incredibly expensive for Australians who might want to use that gas, and as has been articulated at length at MacroBusiness, gas is the marginal price setter for our electricity, and that makes us as Australians very expensive, and we're very expensive anyway. Is there, like, my initial thought in the lead up to the last election was that the one outstanding productivity measure proposed in that election campaign by someone who I didn't like at all was Dutton's call for the reservation of gas. Do either of you see any potential for someone turning on the 10 watts and saying, yeah, okay, that would probably give us some sort of starting position?
100% we should do it. Sorry, I'll just go first if you don't mind. So what Dutton's policy was regarding East Coast gas reservation was excellent. So just to give, for anyone who's not up to speed on what's happened, I'll give a quick explanation. So Western Australia, we have two separate gas markets in Australia. We've got West Coast and East Coast. They're separate because they're not linked by a gas pipeline, and obviously, you know, we're 4,000 kilometres apart. So two completely separate gas markets. Both markets are major exporters. We export far more than we use domestically. But the West Coast, the difference is the Western Australian government was intelligent, and their state government back in about 2004, I think it was the Carpenter government, when they were setting up their liquefied natural gas export terminals to start exporting gas, to liquefy it, to freeze it, turn into liquid, to then put on a ship. They said, you must supply, all gas companies must supply Western Australians first with at least 15%. Yep. 15% of all gas must go to Western Australians. And as a result, as they've expanded their industry, the Western Australian economy has received adequate gas supplies. It's pushed down the price of gas, which then also helps to keep electricity prices down, because gas is one of the marginal price setters of electricity. So Western Australia has, relatively cheap energy on an international basis. On the East Coast, we did the completely wrong thing. So the East Coast of Australia is the only gas exporting jurisdiction in the world that exports gas but doesn't have any requirement to supply Australians first, which is absurd. So the Rudd-Gillard government, back, under their term when all these gas export terminals were being proposed, approved these terminals without any requirement to supply Australians first. And as a result, a bunch of companies built 6 gas export facilities, turbines, up in Gladstone in Queensland, and they came online in 2015. And as soon as they came online, the East Coast gas price over that subsequent, decade has roughly tripled. It went up. It's gone up a lot more than that in periods after, say, Russia invaded Ukraine. But we effectively have international prices now on the East Coast. Yeah. And at the same time as we've doubled the East Coast gas production, so the amount of gas actually pulled out of the ground has doubled since 2015. We're actually supplying 25% less to the domestic market. Yeah. Right? So this has been an absolute disaster policy, because what it's done is it's driven up the cost of gas, which has obviously made manufacturing less competitive, because gas is a key industrial heat is incredibly important. And if you make that expensive, manufacturing slows down. So we've seen our last plastics manufacturer, Queenslanders, shut down. Our last architectural glass maker, Oceanic Glasses, shut down, both due to high energy costs. Thousands of smaller manufacturers have shut down. Incitec Pivot, which is a major fertilizer company, has shut down the fertilizer operations, or is about to shut down the last one. They've shut down several already because of high energy costs. Orica, major explosives used in mining and fertilizer, has threatened to downsize and shift to America because America's cheap gas and the East Coast doesn't. BlueScope Steel, similar. So effectively, Australia's manufacturing is shrinking because of high energy costs. And these high gas prices on the East Coast also feed into the electricity price, because gas is a key marginal price setter in the wholesale market. It's not the only driver, but it's a driver of a high electricity cost. And that's also made the economy less in manufacturing, but also the rest of the economy less competitive, because obviously electricity and gas prices are a key input to everything. And at the same time, the government wants to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years. We've made the inputs into those homes more expensive because, for example, brickworks needs industrial heat to make bricks. Well, we've made that cost input through gas incredibly expensive, which puts up the price of bricks, which makes it more expensive to build homes. That's just one example. So
can I come across to you again there? It has been put out through some media outlets that if all of a sudden we introduce gas reservation in Australia, it is effectively sovereign risk to the companies who've already invested in producing Australian gas. Would you buy that in a world where Australian gas for Australians is more expensive than Australian gas for Chinese or South Koreans or Japanese?
No, it's ridiculous to even remotely call it sovereign risk. Sovereign risk was all about the national government or governments claiming assets with no compensation. That's sovereign risk. You fund these projects. I spent half my life funding large projects in banking, and sovereign risk always comes up. But sovereign risk in relation to reservation or taxing, the government has to be able to have flexibility. I mean, it's like going, we're going to set all the rules today and never change them. I mean, that's not how the world works. And to think even remotely that corporations wouldn't invest in other projects, and that doesn't mean not gas projects, but just other projects, whether they're mining projects or whatever, because they think Australia's a sovereign risk, is not just laughable, it's bloody fraudulent. It's just nothing further from the truth. They love investing.
So without that type of investment, as Leeds pointed out, as you pointed out a number of times, unless Australia is doing something which is globally competitive, in the context of, as Leeds just pointed out, manufacturers are getting out as quickly as they can. There is nothing really to replace them. Can you see any productivity benefit taking hold in Australia?
No, we have to have the crisis. I don't know when it's coming. I mean, coming back on a few things, and Leith used Norway as an example, which is a great example, and pointed out something very important, and that is the sovereign wealth fund invested offshore. That's because they run a current account surplus.
Yeah.
You can't have a sovereign wealth fund if you run a deficit, because all you're doing is turning yourself into a hedge fund, a la Australia.
Yeah.
And we're supposed to believe that our superannuation funds in huge amount is something put away. Well, if you look at it from the economy and the country's perspective, no, it isn't. It's there. That would always exist. It would be much better for us to have that circulating through the economy, looking for productive pursuits, not put in places where it's managed by people that effectively don't do much. And a lot of it actually now invested offshore, which as I said, is a hedge fund, borrowing money on one hand and investing it out on the other.
That point that you're talking to, that was actually touched on by John Kehoe in the AFR last week, when he said, well, okay, the Commonwealth Bank is now worth $300 billion. It's a very major global bank, but that's underpinned, or Australia's banking system is underpinned by lending 2/3 for domestic housing, which the rest of the world refers to as non-productive lending. That's inflating the assets backing the banking system, which is inflating. We've got this circular bubble once again.
Well, and again, that's where superannuation comes in, and we're building this internal allocation of capital which is misallocated, and a lot of it going into the Commonwealth Bank, building up the prices, when effectively there is no incentive for those that manage the superannuation funds to do anything else with it, but go along with the effective Ponzi or hedge fund sort of description of the economy.
Leith, do you see anything like the thing that keeps floating before my eyes is this cannot keep going on forever? And I would have thought we're a long way down the road where we're driving off the cliff and there's the sign saying you're about to drive off. Do either of you think that someone must do something?
Can I just add something first? So getting back to the sovereign risk thing. For starters, Dutton's, what Graham said is 100% correct, but also Dutton's plan on gas reservation was never going to raise any sovereign risk because it wasn't going to touch LNG contracts.
Yeah.
Right. So it was only going to be gas that's currently exported into the spot market. Sorry, spot gas. So uncontracted gas. He was only going to target that and divert that to the domestic market, and he was going to do it via export levies. So, for example, if these gas companies on the East Coast wanted to sell uncontracted gas, they'd get charged a levy on it, and he was going to make the levy high enough so that it A, raised tax revenue, but B, if they didn't want to sell in the export market, they'd have to sell domestically. So there was no sovereign risk there because it's uncontracted gas. So that whole notion is just ridiculous.
I just find sovereign risk being used as a sort of bogeyman to frighten Australian politicians or bureaucrats.
100%.
When the rest of the world does not look at Australia and think sovereign risk. The rest of the world probably looks at Australia, and I'm in touch with other capital markets, and they look at Australia and think, well, what is Australia doing in an economic policy sense? And with the case of the approach to Santos, which has been backed by the board, that's effectively putting a cartel which is led by the Abu Dhabi oil and gas producer, where they do reserve gas for people in the state of Abu Dhabi. but they're giving them an investment position in a model which doesn't give Australians that same benefit of gas reservation. I just find it completely crazy.
Yeah, and to Graham's second point about, you know, Norway can do that because it's got a current account surplus. Well, Australia would too. If Australia hadn't grown like a science experiment, we still had, you know, 20-ish million people, and we did tax our commodities properly, etc., we would have a current account surplus. But one of the reasons why we don't is because we import a whole bunch of people who buy imports, like imported cars, imported TV, you know, TVs, whatever,
Furniture.
but they don't actually generate any export revenue.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why we don't have a current account surplus, a structural current account surplus when we should. Now, you know, Norway probably wouldn't either if they tripled their population. You know, I'm just guessing, but you know, you know, there are other economic models that we could do, and the fact of the matter is, you know, Treasurer Chalmers, he's declared war on productivity, but he's also declared war on the budget deficit. So you know, the other part of his speech is he wants to shore up the sustainability of the budget, because the budget is, you know, effectively in a structural deficit. And yes, he should do that, but one of the ways you can do that is actually taxing our massive resource base properly. Australia could have all the money it needs if it simply did that, but unfortunately, we don't do that.
I'll just raise the point at that level. If you think, okay, we want a balanced budget, which I totally buy, but if you look at the state of Victoria, and that's the state I'm in, I cannot see Victoria running a balanced budget again in my lifetime, really.
Yeah, we could, but it'd be if there was a massive. So there already has been a redistribution of GST revenues. So Victoria's, you know, got an extra $7.5 billion over 2 years. We're now a net GST taker from other states, and you know, if we keep going down this road, and if the federal government starts handing us more and more GST, and we start getting more and more direct, you know, transfers from the federal government, I guess it's possible, but you know, unlikely, because debt just continues to go up. We're probably going to get a credit rating downgrade, another one. We've already got the lowest credit rating in the country, which is going to push up the cost of our debt. We've got about $200 billion worth of, well, forecast to have, and over the forward estimates, the state budget forward estimates, about $200 billion of debt. You know, if the our interest payments on debt are forecast to go to $10 billion a year by the end of the forward estimates. So obviously, if there's a credit rating downgrade, the interest cost is going to go up. And at the same time, Victoria is a very narrow tax base, which we're squeezing as hard as we can already. They've basically put taxes on everything they can put taxes on.
With regard to Treasurer Chalmers' talk about taxation reform, can I just I'll go first to you, DT, but I'll also come back to you with the same question, Leith. What can the government do to broaden the tax base, and what do you think effective tax reform really needs to address?
Well, we've got to make the tax base more equitable and fairer. And I know people say that, but there needs to be an emphasis away from personal income taxes and certainly into consumption taxes. And let's be fair, as Leith said, a lot of the exports, and you said a lot of our exports should have levies on them that go into the Commonwealth government as well, whatever we're going to call them, sort of reverse tariffs. I don't think you can change the tax base hugely from a political stance unless, again, I keep saying it, but yeah, we have some sort of crisis.
Yeah.
We have to change the housing taxation around housing. And you know, I think we should turn it on its head. Instead of saying get rid of negative gearing, I think we should give everyone negative gearing, everyone.
Yeah.
The capital gains tax we can work out, but everyone is on the same level, and renters get a tax deduction for rent, funded through GST. At least that'll give a platform when you decrease immigration, of steadying and making the housing market much more affordable, but also just not as a speculation. It's a store of wealth without being speculation. You've got to do those things before you're going to see a result in relation to productivity and industries that will increase exports on a very long-term basis. We certainly have to have reservation. We certainly have to have much, much lower energy prices, however it's done. We can do anything. With the resources we've got, we have cheap energy and cheap water. We can do anything, just putting our mind to it. Instead, we're importing people and building houses. That's not in anyone's interest whatsoever in the general population. There's a very small number of people and rent seekers of how the society is set up that benefit from those things.
But they're actually using a human shield approach insofar as Australia has a construction sector which is about 11% of the labour force, which is getting up towards 2 to 3 times what the OECD average for a construction sector would be. Leith, how do we tone down housing constructor as an economic driver while lowering housing costs, but also without bringing down the whole economy? I throw that to you. I know that's a difficult question to answer, but I just see, we're in a dynamic where there's so many does not compute moments. The size of our housing construction sector must surely rank as one of them. And also the amount of money that we funnel into housing construction and housing speculation is just reached a point where, we are standouts at a global level for both the housing construction, but also the price of our houses and the price of our houses in relation to what we actually earn in our jobs.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I mean, again, certainly we need to look at all the tax concession side and all that stuff that Graham just mentioned. But ultimately, the step number one is stop fire hosing demand into Australia every single year, right? So the official projection for Australia is, my first thing is stop doing the things that are causing the problems or that are driving a lot of the problems, right? So stop, as Mark Twain would say, when you're in a hole, stop digging.
Yeah.
Now, we've, as I said, we've grown 8.7 million people this century. That's obviously driven massive demand for housing. It's meant that we've had to build a whole bunch of stuff just to try and keep up, and we haven't kept up, whether it's housing or infrastructure. Again, that's one of the reasons why our productivity sucks. But it's also just distorted the economy because we've had to just try and just channel so much of the economy into trying to keep up with this mass population growth that has stopped us from doing more productive things. Now, the official projection from the Centre for Population, that's run out of the Treasury, they do a population statement every year. It feeds in the intergeneration report, which comes out every 5 years, etc. Is Australia is supposed to grow by 13.5 million people in the next 40 years. Now, that, just to put that into perspective, 13.5 million people is like grabbing the current Sydney, the current Melbourne, and the current Brisbane, those three capital cities. Think about all the houses, all the people, all the infrastructure in those three cities, and cut and pasting that into the current Australian population in just 40 years. So Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane is about 13.5 million people, just under 13.5 million people. We're supposed to add that in 40 years. Obviously, if you're going to add a Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, another Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane in 40 years, you're going to need a hell of a lot of housing and a hell of a lot of infrastructure, a hell of a lot of water, a hell of a lot of energy, hell of a lot of everything, which means you got to have a massive construction sector.
Can I just add a really ugly point right there? If we continue on the model that we're running, we're going to bring all those people in, and they'll all 95% of them will be in uncompetitive,
Sydney, Melbourne,
not remotely exposed employment positions, which, as has been pointed out of MacroBusiness, there's, we've got the beard trimmers, we've got the cafe society, we've got fitness gurus everywhere, but none of this is actually driving productive reform.
No, and every single one of those people that we bring in who works in one of these people servicing roles buys imported TVs, buys imported cars, buys imported everything, right? So we are effectively importing people to purchase imports, right? And we're not adding to our export capacity. Because again, the lion's share, like almost all of it, of Australia's exports come from the regions.
Yeah.
Right. At the same time, the whole policy is to grow the capital cities like science experiments, which requires tons of housing infrastructure, all sorts of investment in everything, water supplies. We're going to have to build desal plants everywhere to keep up, all this sort of stuff. It's all totally non-productive and stupid when you think about it. When the counterfactual is Norway, which doesn't do any of this stuff and actually taxes its resources properly and is incredibly rich per person. They are
and also
incredibly
takes
rich.
measures to make sure their currency doesn't inflate to a level where it blows away their competitive position.
Yeah, and looks after its own residents first, right? So, Australia is all about looking after our own residents last. So whether that's just through crush loading, through, just interested in growing the overall economic pie, not everyone slice the pie, or whether it's with regards to energy, I'd argue that Australia is the second biggest gas exporter in the world, and probably in the West Coast it works. Like they get, mining royalties. They've still got cheap gas and electricity prices, so they're not getting absolutely fleeced. On the East Coast, it's a negative. So yes, the foreign-owned gas companies earn squillions off our gas. The Queensland government gets a little bit of royalties, maybe a couple $2 billion now. Like it's taken them a decade to get there because they have to work through all their investment incentives, their concessions they got. But now they're finally getting paid royalties. But everyone who lives on the east coast of Australia now is paying higher gas and electricity prices because of gas exports. So I'd argue that it's actually a drain. It's actually wrecking the economy. So in a lot of ways, the east coast of Australia would probably be better off if someone, I'm not saying they should do it, I'm not invoking terrorism, but if theoretically someone went and shut down those Gladstone LNG terminals, we'd probably be richer because we suddenly would have an abundance of gas and cheap gas and electricity prices. Yes, we wouldn't
DT, you're in Queensland. I'm not suggesting you jump in the car and head on up to Gladstone, but can you think of anything which, short of the crisis you're talking about, which might start to turn us around as a national economy?
It's a very big question. Well, and I'll have approach it a slightly different way. I think we've got to work out why we have government policy that can't see what's staring you in the face. Now, I live also, which I only moved to, but live in an electorate which is next to Dutton's and next to, in Luke Howarth, who is the assistant treasurer, or assistant opposition treasurer, in very strong Liberal seats. And the bookies got it wrong because both of them were like 20 to 1 on to win their seats on the Friday. They both lost easily.
I hope you're not confessing to being a man who bets on political outcomes, eh?
I bet on anything. But yes, at 9 to 1 for a Labor 2-horse race. But no, you can feel it in the streets now. You can feel the discontent in the suburbs going around. And forget this aspiration of Liberal Party bullshit that John Howard brought. No one believes it anymore. So they look and say, I can see Queensland exporting huge amounts of coal, huge amounts of gas, and our standard of living is going down. What the hell is going on?
Yeah.
So this is only a recent phenomenon, the last few years, suddenly seeing it. So the question is, why are the politicians ignoring all of this? And maybe it is
Jim
just
Chalmers' seat's surely not far from you.
On the other side of the river, but it's not far. No. So and his socio-economic area is pretty poor, so maybe they haven't caught up yet. But I've got to say that the ability of the public to wake up, it takes time, but they will wake up. If you looked at, there was such interesting, Leith, you posted an article yesterday or whatever it was. I was going to quote on it, which was the popularity of politicians from and effectively clearly published before the election. And that's it at all. Dutton's popularity and trustworthiness was up there with Putin and Xi, not quite, but way up there. Now, there is your prediction of the election instead of it being close. So Albo may have got over the line very, very well, but because no one trusted the opposition, that really was it. Now, it doesn't take much because of if everything stays the same, everyone, even new immigrants, are not going to trust Labor. They're not going to trust Albo. They're not going to trust Chalmers. And you could see a very quick turnaround, not just in polls, but at the next election. I really want to see there to be a proper party, not just Teals, sort of being a third wheel, and not just Greens as well, because they've lost a lot of credibility with this.
Well, they're profoundly open borders, for starters.
Yeah, well, first of all, that's exactly right. It just doesn't make any sense. So when are these people going to get sense in relation to what affects the population and what they should be doing? I don't know why they think they can just get away with it forever.
Can I just add something to that, Graham? So it's interesting your comments about Queenslanders, right? So I do regular interviews. You probably heard me on the radio, gas bagging, but with Bill McDonald at 4BC, and as well as Steve Austin at ABC Brisbane. And mate, I get exactly the same sense as what you've just said. I often explain to them the absurdity of how much Queenslanders pay for gas. So people probably don't realise this, but Queenslanders actually pay higher gas prices than Victorians, right? So just let that sink in for a bit. Most of the domestic market gas is actually supplied by Victoria through a Gippsland gas. So people don't realise that. We actually export
the old
gas.
Bass Strait.
Yeah, that's it. So Victoria actually exports gas north half the year. It's just during these winter months when it's cold in Victoria that we take Queensland gas, but we actually export to Queensland half the year. But the absurdity of it is we export nearly 3/4 of total East Coast gas out of Gladstone, right? So Queensland produces the most gas, but most of it's exported.
Yeah.
And yet Queenslanders pay slightly higher gas prices than Victorians. We're all getting gouged, but they actually
there's
pay.
An even greater element of madness than even what you've just said. And that is that about 2/3 to 70% of all gas used is actually used to liquefy the gas to export it.
No. So what it is, so about 70% of what we use domestically is used to liquefy.
Right.
Out of the total, because the domestic, so that's at a national level. So that includes WA gas, but effectively you lose about 8 to 9% of your gas when you got to liquefy it because it's so energy intensive.
Right, okay.
So, but point taken. If we exporting gas is actually, if you're an environmentalist or a greenie, you should hope that it's kept domestically, because when you sell it offshore, you've got to convert to liquid first, which is incredibly energy intensive. You lose about 9% of your gas, or 8 or 9%, during the liquefaction process, because you've got to basically freeze it down to 190 degrees negative, right?
Yeah.
So it uses a ton of energy. And then you've got to transport it across the world. And then you've got to turn it back into gas. This is all takes heaps of energy. Whereas if we just use it domestically, it'd just be gas straight out of the ground, no liquefaction, a lot better. Like, it's more efficient, etc. But
if it was used locally, presumably we would have export-facing industries or manufacturers who could use the cheap energy to provide jobs here, to have Australians doing something with skills and attributes which was globally competitive.
Yeah, and this gets back to the absurdity of selling Santos the proposal sells Santos to Abu Dhabi, right? So Santos has 2 export trains. They are probably the most pervasive, the worst out of the gas cartel. I'll tell you why, because when this whole LNG export business was coming around, Santos was going to build 1 export train, and they're only going to build one train. They planned to build 1 because they only had enough gas that they controlled for 1 export train. But instead, at the last moment, they said, you know what, we'll just roll the dice. We're going to build 2. And what they meant was that they didn't have enough gas their own gas that they were mining to fill the export train. So then they started actually to fill the second one and to meet their contracts, they started pilfering southern gas. So Santos has actually been sucking up Victorian gas, Queensland gas anywhere they can from the domestic market to meet their export contracts. And that's one of the reasons why we've been starved on the east coast of gas. And now we want to sell that. Now the plan is to sell that company, which is rogering us left, right, and centre, to a Middle Eastern company. Like, this is just clown show stuff, and it just basically shows that Australia is a place to be pilfered for overseas cartels. Not
well,
for
Australians are a people to be rogered, I think, is the point you're getting to.
Yes, that's right. So it's crazy, and this sort of stuff should not be allowed. It should be blocked, or if it's not blocked, it should be okay. You can do it, but here we're going to slap on an almighty big domestic innovation policy, and we're going to tax your. We're going to do an export levy as well. That's the only way this should be allowed. But when I do these radio interviews, the Queenslanders are furious about it. Right, because I listen to it when I get off air. I often turn it on. I listen to people calling in, and they're furious. They can't understand why Queensland is the nation's biggest coal exporter. So coal's a critical input to electricity.
Yeah.
Why 3/4 roughly, or just under, but 72, 73% of East Coast gas flows out of Gladstone, and yet they're paying these absurdly high prices. And yes, the pain has been numbed somewhat by subsidies, but that's subsidies which is taken out of their own tax revenue, which could be used elsewhere to fund infrastructure, to fund schools, hospitals, this sort of stuff. It's absurd. And to their credit, one thing I will give the previous state government in Queensland, they did a fantastic thing when they raised coal royalties by stealth during the budget 2 years ago, because that raised an extra, I think, $10 billion for Queenslanders, and that's exactly the sort of policy we need. But unfortunately, that government got rewarded by being booted out. But it was excellent policy.
Can I just raise a point there that our current federal government has gas subsidies running through until the end of this year, and my current assumption is that they will face the question of either we somehow reduce gas prices or we need to extend those subsidies. DT, just as we go out, we can't talk too much longer, but what are your thoughts about that particular dynamic? Because I've heard exactly what you're talking about. I've heard the discontent on the streets. I'm in Southern Australia, obviously. But I think it's pervasive across the board. I think it's broader than politicians. I think corporate leaders, bureaucrats, university rectors or academics, I think there's a discrediting of an entire elite unfolding before our eyes.
And don't forget Coles and Woolworths as well.
Yeah, and the banks, and
the banks, yes. Look, trying to keep it simple and straightforward. You can fool some of the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And I think that's where we're getting to. I think that they look at subsidies again, and a one-off subsidy, and if things went back to normal, like we had another pandemic and you had a once-off payment to people, they go, fine, that was a good thing to do. If you're trying to solve a long-term problem with a subsidy, people will see through that, and they want solutions. They'll take it, of course. They're not going to give it back.
Yeah.
But they'll see it as being walking away from the problem or walking away from the solution. And, we have wars going on. Who knows what China might do with some of these things going on. Our exports to China will be cut off, within overnight. Overnight. That's a possibility. You don't put yourself in that position as a responsible government. But we have, and there's no one coming up with any solutions. Have a productivity summit full of, as an echo chamber, full of economists. Apologies, Lee. But
no, mate, go for it.
I don't think they'll get too many economists there. I think there'll be a load of corporate identities, presumably a load of political identities, maybe a few academics. They'll talk productivity. I would have thought any self-respecting economist would come on out and say, hang on, we've got major issues.
Nah, mate. It doesn't work that way in Australia, mate. Most economists are compromised, right? You just have to look at the Jobs and Skills Summit, where, around about that time where 80% plus were calling for immigration to be ramped up to levels we've never seen before.
That's what we've got.
Yeah, it is, exactly. And sometimes for fun, I actually go back to read what economists were saying during the pandemic, etc., about immigration and other things, and their policy prescriptions were exactly the wrong thing, right? I know I'm harping back the immigration thing, but because I looked at it the other day, there was a poll done in the conversation, and 80% plus were saying we need immigration levels we've never seen before to do catch-up migration because of productivity, blah, 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 blah. So I guarantee you, most economists work for outfits that are compromised. They're either they work for vested interests, whether it's industry groups, whatever, and they're funded to toe the company line. Others are just neoliberals who just see the world through their view that's wrong.
And they're reliant on government funding. And
that's it, mate. So the fact of the matter is, like, having a whole bunch of economists there is not going to save us. It's probably going to make it worse, because most economists in Australia are compromised, or they don't know what they're talking about, quite frank.
Gentlemen, on that note, I think we probably should finish up about there. It's very, very gloomy. We will come back at some point down the track, because as DT's just mentioned, the global macro, the external, seems to me to be deteriorating by the day. But for the here and now, thank you both very much for your time.
Thanks, Wade.
Thank you, Graham.
Thank you very, very much.